far as I can see, there are no apologies. I'll just check again. I think we've got everybody who should be here. And therefore, moving on, are there any declarations of interest? No declarations of interest. Good. I also ought to explain that obviously this particular cabinet meeting, as the previous one, is being broadcast in the normal way via a live broadcast via the County Council's website. If there are no declarations of interest, I move on to the minutes of the previous meeting held in May. Are there any comments on those minutes? If so, if not, can I have your approval for the previous minutes in the normal way by putting your hands up? And I note that we have approval for the previous meeting, of the minutes of the previous meeting. Thank you very much. Now we move on to deputations, and we have, as I understand it, a number of deputations. I've got 3 deputations here. That I've received 3 deputations. The first, and I'll take them one after the other, the first one is Phil Joyce from Extension Rebellion, Winchester. If I could ask Phil Joyce to make his presentation, please, under the deputation rules.
Having pressed star 6, I assume you can hear me now.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Thank you. Right. Well, thank you everybody for inviting us to present our Safer Streets Winchester petition. With over 760 signatures, it demonstrates the breadth of support in Winchester for reducing traffic within the ancient centre and creating safe conditions for pedestrians and cyclists. The government's Emergency Active Travel Scheme offers funding and an opportunity for the council to make a significant start. However, work so far falls well short of the aspirations of the petition. According to the government's own data, traffic emissions are 58% of the total emissions for our district. Therefore, we believe further work must do the following. 1, reallocate 1 lane of traffic for use by pedestrians and cyclists on busy streets with the narrowest pavements, such as St George's Street, North Wall, City Bridge, Stockbridge Road, and Romsey Road. Point 2, restrict the use of inner city car parks to blue badge holders and city centre residents to significantly reduce traffic, ensuring that vehicle capacity reductions are sustainable in the long term. 3, limit road access to city centre to cyclists, public transport, blue badge holders, residents and emergency vehicles. 4, permanently pedestrianise areas where there is a high density of people, such as the Square, Jury Street, the upper part of High Street. And 5, reallocate road space to pedestrians and cyclists to provide safe routes from all areas into the city centre. As lockdown is eased, we must ensure sufficient space for the safety of pedestrians and cyclists. Hampshire County Council guidance refers to numerous studies that demonstrate increased pedestrianisation leads to better business. In the longer term, these arrangements would encourage sustained high levels of walking and cycling and prevent the return of dangerous levels of pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in our city. The freedom from traffic in the square is already much appreciated. We urge you to take heart from the support in the petition and raise your ambitions even higher. Thank you for accepting my deputation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Joyce. Could I now ask the second deputation to speak in the form of Martin Heath from the Basingstoke and Dean Transition Network, and you'll be speaking in particular relation to item 10, the climate change strategy. Martin Heath.
Oh, Martin, if you are currently muted, you will need to unmute your device pressing *6.
Okay, can you now hear me?
Yes, you're loud and clear, Mr. Heath.
My apologies. Apparently my phone was muted, so you missed the first 30 seconds, which I will now repeat. Yeah, many thanks, Chair. As you say, I wanted to speak to item 10. I'm Martin Heath. I'm from Basingstoke Transition Network, and we're a group of volunteers in the north of the county. We are helping to move Basingstoke from to a low carbon and a high sustainability world. My background is many years ago, I trained as a physicist. I spent my entire career in the science and technology and engineering industries, heavily involved in renewables. So I wanted really to sort of make a couple of points, not too many, but I think the very first one is that the decision that we, by that I mean all of us, are going to be making today, and the decisions we're going to be making over the next few years will have an impact on future generations for 100 years or more. And I know it's a bit of a cliche, but we truly are at a crossroads. Now we can choose a path of responsibility, the path that leads to a better, cleaner, more sustainable future, or we can dither. We can decide to proceed slowly, or even worse, perhaps go off in the wrong direction. But I think the strategy that's laid out before you in item 10 is good, but it's a bit like a map. It lays out a way forward, not necessarily the only way forward. But my concern is that that map is not yet complete, and that we're starting our journey far too slowly. And I don't think this is the time to sit back and say that we have plenty of time, because 2050 does seem a long way ahead. But it's going to the decisions we make now will have a huge impact on how we get to 2050. And it's not something that we can let future generations deal with. I think it's something we have to deal with, and we have to deal with it now. I think this is a time that we should make some very bold decisions and move with pace to a carbon-free world, not slowly. Now, as we know, climate change is caused by three things. It's caused by burning fossil fuels. The fuels we use to heat our buildings, move our vehicles, and power our electrical machines. It's also produced by the way we manage our land and our waste. And of course, what we eat and the way we grow our food also has a major influence on our climate. Now, 80% of the impact on our climate is due to burning those fossil fuels that I talked about. But we shouldn't ignore the other 20%. Now, in the strategy at the moment, there is a danger that we might do that. Burning fossil fuels, yes, does create carbon dioxide, but it creates several other greenhouse gases as well. The strategy seems to be far too focused on just CO2. We should not also ignore the other sources, which can add millions of tons of greenhouse gases to our atmosphere. Things like methane, hydrofluorocarbons, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur fluorohexide, for instance, to name just 3 or 4. There is a danger we might be missing those. The figures that were presented in the strategy seem to miss these out, as does the emissions caused by international travel, by shipping, and by goods that we import. We've got to take account of all of our emissions, not just some of our emissions. Now, in Hampshire, we produce about 6 million tonnes of CO2 and another 20% or more in the other greenhouse gases that I've just mentioned. And that's about 7.2 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And we've done reasonably well since 2005. That number is reduced from nearly 10 million tonnes down to where we are today, 7.2 million. But almost all of that reduction is due to the actions of others outside our county. It's not because of what we've done in Hampshire. is due to the massive shift from coal to renewable electricity in the main. Indeed, our transport emissions have actually gone up since 2005. So in Hampshire, we have not yet played our part. So now, I think, is the time for us to take responsibility for our own actions in our own county and not let others in other parts of the UK clean up our mess for us. So let me just focus on that 80%, the 80% produced by burning fossil fuels. To get to net zero, well, we need to use less energy, and we're going to have to be far more efficient in the way we use that energy. This requires massive insulation of our existing buildings and ensuring all new ones are built to be carbon zero. It also requires the electrification of heat and transport. It requires huge modal shifts from personal cars to public transport and to walking and cycling. We need to generate the energy we need from renewable or low carbon sources. And that means more renewable energy, more renewable heat, and more renewable transport fuels, hydrogen being a good example. And as in point one, this requires a massive transformation to electrical heating, electrical transport, to a hydrogen economy, and to other renewable fuel sources. And we've got to ensure that the energy we need in Hampshire is generated locally. We cannot allow or rely on other counties to do it for us. But the latest figures I've seen is just 1.6% of the energy needs of us in Hampshire are being met by Hampshire resourced renewable energy. We still produce more heat in Hampshire from burning coal than we do from renewable heat. Now that is a situation that just cannot be allowed to continue. Particularly as Hampshire is blessed with some of the best renewable resources, I was going to say in the UK, but in the world. You know, we have woods, we have biomass, we have wind, we have some of the best tidal resources in the whole world along our the southern coast. And of course, we have the sun. We have a huge opportunity to create thousands of new jobs in our county and save billions of pounds a year. Yet, that opportunity just may well slip through our fingers. Now, the strategy before us is good, but it's not good enough. Its targets are too low and too far off and too distant. It does not recognise the opportunities, it just looks at the threats. If we implement the strategy it currently stands, Hampshire will be nothing more than a Me Too follower. And make no mistake, a carbon zero world would need a massive transformation in the way we think, the way we organise, and the way we conduct our lives. That transformation must start now and start today. So I think we need a bold plan, one that puts Hampshire at the leading edge, not a follower, one that creates jobs, one that improves our environment, and one that makes Hampshire a leader rather than a follower. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Heath. And finally, can I ask Philippa Brearley to speak again on climate change?
I'll just press. Can
Thank
you hear me
you.
all right?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Oh, hello. Well, good morning, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. My name is Philippa Brearley, and I live in Alton. I'm a member of Alton Climate Action and Network, and also Hampshire Climate Action Network. I'm also speaking as a very concerned citizen. I would like to start by saying how very much I welcome this initiative, as I believe that measures to deal with the climate crisis have to be led from the community at grassroots level. Thus, having the county council, supported by the population, put forward this pretty comprehensive plan is most gratifying. But I am worried that even with these measures, it won't be enough. There are two issues I would like to raise this morning. The first is the 2050 deadline. This is in line with the UK national target, but meeting it will not keep our emissions low enough to avoid a 1.5 or even a 2-degree rise. I appreciate that the initiative states that this date will be brought forward in various projects where possible, and I do very much hope that these intentions will be realised. However, there does seem to be a lack of comprehension of just how very urgent and very serious the situation is, both at a national level and a county level. The UN Paris International Agreement was to keep global warming within 1.5 degrees, 2 at the most, but we're currently on course for 3 or 4 degrees or more, which will mean climate breakdown, causing widespread crop failures, mass migration, extreme weather events, and the rest. We have just 10 years to get greenhouse gases under control, no more. Carbon Brief have calculated that we need to continue to reduce emissions by the 20% globally achieved during lockdown to get back on course for a 2-degree limit. That would be quite some achievement. Now, I would also like to comment on paragraphs 32 to 34 to engage with residents and communities. This is a very welcome and necessary move. But I would just like to point out that there are many other groups besides the Greening Campaign with their own blueprints in the county that have been active in some cases for a number of years. Energy Alton, which has been working on green projects for at least 10 years, last year gave rise to ACAN, which is Alton Climate Action and Network. Both of these groups have excellent websites. ACAN has had a remarkable success in initiating multiple subgroups in the town and networking with other towns. We have a tagline, tackling the climate crisis together. And we aim for maximum community engagement for the twin purposes of education and awareness leading to behaviour change and actual reduction of emissions by reducing consumerism and waste, increased awareness of natural environment, improving insulation in buildings, and campaigning for improvements in transport, as well as all sorts of others. Some of the more successful and popular groups include a repair cafe, the community cupboard that arranges with local supermarkets to distribute surplus food to anyone who can use it. Alton and Village's Local Action for Nature, AVLAN. They advise on wildflower and bee-friendly gardening, as well as exploring the options for pocket parks and similar projects. The lobbying group of representatives attend council meetings at all 3 levels and also keep in contact with our local MP. A new cycling group and a permaculture group have both recently started since lockdown, and our latest project is the Alton Community Share. This was requested by the town council, and we've been using the community centre in a very tightly controlled manner to operate a sort of library of toys, books, games, craft materials and so on to keep families busy during lockdown. It has been hugely successful. And at the Share, we have climate-related materials on display, and we encourage visitors to sign up for our newsletter. There's also WINAC, the Winchester Action on Climate Change. They've been established since 2007 and they have an extremely interesting website. And HCAN, Hampshire Climate Action Network, of course, has also been active for quite some time. Other groups in Hampshire include PCAN, based in Petersfield, and groups in New Forest, Havant, Portsmouth, Gosport and Fareham, Basingstoke, Test Valley, Blackwater Valley, and no doubt others that I don't know anything about. Please be aware that the amount of community engagement that there is in the county, and utilise all these organisations. We're very glad to see that the Hants County Council are reaching out to the community with a stakeholder event in August and the request for views received yesterday. We very much hope that this level of engagement will be sustained. It is absolutely vital to achieving the rapid reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases that we so desperately need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippa Braley. May I thank all 3 speakers for their contributions. As you know, I was myself a member of the Select Committee on the Environment in the House of Commons for 4 years, and I introduced 4 bills on the environment into Parliament during my period in the House of Commons. So I personally very much support the project that we've got in terms of the climate emergency and trying to stop the rise in temperature of the planet. So thank you, all 3 of you, very much for your contributions. We will certainly bear them in mind when we come to discuss particularly item 10, but also the other items on the agenda. And you're obviously very welcome to continue listening and watching our proceedings through the channel that is available for public broadcasts. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 5. Before doing so, I'd ought to tell the Cabinet that the Chief Executive is still having trouble getting on.
Unknown participant is now exiting.
As I've said,
Leader, I am with the meeting now. Thank you very much.
okay,
Unknown
that's fine.
participant is now exiting.
In that case,
Unknown participant is now exiting.
We will then continue with the agenda as it's shown before you, starting with my opening remarks. I will keep them brief. We're clearly now in the recovery phase from at least the first phase of the pandemic that we've suffered from for now 4 to 5 months. I very much welcome the decision by the government late last night for face masks to be worn when we enter shops and other buildings. Personally, I think that is the right decision. I think it will have an effect on the transmission of the disease by reducing it, albeit, depending upon which experts you listen to, by a very small amount, but by others, a significant amount. I'd also like to I'd also like to explain to the Cabinet that immediately after this meeting, we will be having our first meeting of the Local Outbreak Engagement Board. That, as you know, is the public-facing part of the new locally based actions we are taking to try to suppress small outbreaks across the country. And in particular in Hampshire, I'm very keen indeed that we get timely, quick information, ideally down to a postcode level, but if that's not possible, as low a level as possible, so that we can actually identify any hotspots within the county very quickly and deal with those hotspots before they develop into wider positive indications that the pandemic is spreading once again. Alongside that work by the Local Outbreak Engagement Board, we will also be ensuring that we take steps to revive the local economy, promote recovery, and promote growth. In this context, it's worth mentioning that the recession in Hampshire is just over 20% over the last few months, compared with the national average of 19%. And therefore, I think it is very important indeed that government realise that this particular pandemic has affected the economy throughout the country, and that we in the South East that have in the past done relatively well compared with other parts of the country, this is no longer true. And therefore, I sincerely hope that we get support, continued support from the government to ensure that our economy in the local area recovers. And in this context, I very much welcome the recent statement by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in relation to the hospitality business sector in particular. Having said that, our own financial position is not nearly as good as it was before the pandemic started. We're having to take significant measures to ensure that we can balance our books, and we will need continued support from the centre if we are to continue to run the county in a way that we have to do so by statute. Now, on that note, I think we'll move on to the next item on the agenda. And as I say, I'm pleased that the Chief Executive is now with us. And item 6, the progress report on the County Council's response to COVID-19. Before asking the Chief Executive to give his statement, I would first of all like to ask Councillor House, the leader of the Liberal Democrat group on the council, to make his presentation to the council prior to us making a decision on this particular item. Councillor House.
Thank you very much, Keith, and good morning, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to thank those people who took part in the deputations this morning. It was really good to have participation from around Hampshire on climate change and issues that really matter for the long-term future of the county and our planet. The report that's before us today on the county's response to COVID is, again, a full and helpful report with a lot of useful information to give us an update on progress, and that's really helpful. I have this morning, Chairman, got two questions to ask and one broader commentary, and I'll move the questions out of the way first. You yourself talked about data just a few moments ago in your introduction to the meeting, and I'd like to have an up-to-date statement, please, where we are on data from government, because as was been said and widely reported in the press, a lot of the statements that are made from government around data sharing don't seem to be bearing reality on the ground around the county, around the country, and that clearly matters a lot in terms of how we handle any flare-ups in the outbreak that there are in our patch. So where are we at on data sharing, and have we now got everything we need from government? The second question is around some of our telephone-based services, and I know that some residents who don't have access to the internet have been concerned that we still haven't managed to properly get all of our telephone-based services up and running again, or certainly not until very, very recently. Can we have confidence that all of those telephone-based services, for example, for blue badges, are now up and running again for residents, so that those people who haven't got access to the internet can manage to get access to services that matter to them? Most other public agencies seem to have managed to get that working. We seem to be a bit of a laggard on this respect. My wider point I just wanted to make quite briefly, Chairman, at this stage, is to note that whilst the report that's in front of us is very good at dealing with the facts and dealing with the issues and the County Council's response to the epidemic, we are going through this process of contain, delay, respond and recovery. But there's a fifth stage that I think we now really ought to be starting to think about for the record and for the long term, and that is learning. We are going through something which we have not in our lifetimes, not even on our parents' lifetimes, gone through before. And we do need to learn from the experiences that we've had over the last 3 or 4 months. And I don't get a sense at the moment that wider governance, and I make that point from parish councils right the way up through to central government, has properly embraced the idea of learning. How are we going to make sure that things that haven't gone right don't get repeated if something like this happens again, or if we have a serious flare-up in the future? And we're not making any statements in that regard. I note, just as one example, that we've had 444 deaths in care home settings in our own county, something like approaching 800 excess deaths in care homes during that period. Some of that was because policy went wrong. Now, it may not be the county council, it may be central government, it may be the NHS, it may be wider processes, but some of that may stick to us. We don't know. And I think it's important that we do start to work through some of those issues of learning so that there is firstly transparency as to what's happened and why, and secondly the genuine opportunity to make sure that we have learned for the future. So I'll just ask where we're at on that process, Chairman, along with the 2 short questions before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith House. I'm certain with regard to the 2 questions that you've asked, if we don't directly, and I hope we will be able to answer them this morning, we will ensure that you get answers to both those questions. As regards the learning from things that haven't gone as well as we would have liked, I'm in entire agreement with you. The importance of any inquiry at the end of the process, both centrally and locally, is not to apportion blame, but to learn exactly how we could have done it better. And I come, as you know, from a background where that is embedded in the aviation community. Not a blame culture, but a learning culture. So I can assure you that we will certainly look at that very closely, how we can actually work out how we can do things better if there is a return of a similar pandemic in the future. So thank you very much. And on that point, I now turn to the Chief Executive to lead us off with item 6, progress report on the County Council's response to the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you very much indeed, Leader, and apologies again that I had a little IT crisis of my own this morning, so I was a little late for the meeting, but that's all sorted now. Thank you very much indeed. If I may say, with regard to the Leader of the Opposition's questions and comments, I think it would be helpful if we picked up the data point under the auspices of the next report to do with the outbreak control processes, because the Director of Public Health will be dealing with that in some detail, and I think he can cover that then. And if I can put my colleague Carolyn Williamson on notice that when I finish presenting, she will pick up on those telephony issues. I don't think we'd recognise the word laggard in the way we're approaching this, but Carolyn will give a briefing about where we're at with telephony and the progress that we've made there. This is a full and comprehensive report, Leader, as has been pointed out. There's a few things to say before I take you through briefly the headlines of the report. First, and obviously, this report is going through our own systems and takes time, and this is a very fast-moving crisis, so there will be elements of the content of the report which inevitably are slightly outdated as soon as they're written. I'll point one or two of those out as we're going forward. You've referred to one already about the wearing of face masks in public following last night's news. The second point I'd make before going ahead is that what the report does do is it shows that we are moving now into a process of recovery, but having to joint manage that recovery process, both through services and more generally with continuous management of the crisis itself. And that's the feature of the work that we're doing. It has been and continues to be an extraordinary crisis. And I'd also obviously want to point out, I think it's been responded to by extraordinary work by the officers and members of the County Council to deal with it as effectively as we have so far. The first substantive section of the report concerns public health and obviously goes to the heart of our management of the crisis and the activity around that. As I've mentioned before, there are some important further reports on today's agenda to formalise our approach to outbreak control planning. The section of the report here, though, also goes into, from paragraph 11 onwards, if you like, the status of the virus and its progress within the county. And generally speaking, as far as one can be confident at this stage, we are continuing on a very slow downward trail from the previous peak of the virus. And that's being well managed across the whole of the county and through the community's cooperation with the social distancing and isolation and related measures. There's a graph at paragraph 17, which is a speculative graph, and I stress that it's speculative, but it's a helpful graph for people to understand why we must continue to focus upon all of the guidance in our management of the community, our management with the community, because of the potential for the next wave, and specialists advise us that there's almost an inevitability to the next wave, but that it should be as low as it possibly can be through the management of the reproduction number. And that graph, I think, speaks for itself, and we're confident in the work that we're doing at the moment. This section of the report goes on to talk about the outbreak control mechanisms which have been helpfully delegated to upper tier local authorities through the Directors of Public Health. And as I've said before, there are further reports going ahead to this Cabinet about the way in which the local authority will have local leadership, including through political arrangements that we've mentioned, to try to oversee how we can see in advance where there are potential risks of outbreaks. Very small numbers count for an outbreak, in order that we can address those considerations and plan accordingly. And the next report to today's Cabinet will take that work further forward. From paragraph 25 onwards, we talk about the role of adults' health and care, the substantial work that they've done working with clients, not just those who are vulnerable to COVID, but the rest of the client group, and particularly our work with our own care homes and with the wider care home community within the county. We have a very large private and independent sector care home community. And paragraph 26 particularly talks about our highly successful redistribution of grant monies to support the care home sector as businesses and to ensure they can carry on giving the right levels of care to all within the community. I'll deal briefly with the point about learning with regard to Councillor House's comments on this point. We're obviously managing our own care homes and working highly effectively with the independent sector to ensure that we do all we possibly can to eradicate the presence of the virus within care homes where there are such vulnerable people. There's no question at all that there has been an issue of national policy about decision making to how patients were discharged from hospital. That will be for a future matter for consideration. I am confident and happy to report to you as Cabinet that we are doing all we can to understand the best ways in which we can control the virus within our care home sector. And I'm very pleased to report that very carefully and gradually this week the care home sector in Hampshire is starting to open up safely to visits to the residents of care homes, which is such an important dimension of their lives through a difficult period. Finally, this section talks about the shielding arrangements which we have led successfully, which are now coming to a close according to government guidance. Paragraph 32 onwards talks about children's services, and particularly the phased approach there. It's important to note that we are now seeing a significant increase in referrals to children's services as universal services, the source of most referrals for most vulnerable children, are back open, and that's to be welcomed, although it's putting pressure upon the services. This section also talks about our work with the schools community in terms of the way they are reopening their doors to children in advance of the summer holidays and preparing for a fuller reopening in September onwards. But we have noted within this section that we have a significant challenge for the full reopening of schools to work with the parent community and schools about transport to schools and home to school transport in particular, given the need for safe measures for transport and the opening of schools. Work is ongoing on that at the moment. Paragraph 42 onwards talks about ETE work, in particular shows that what we have done with regard to the household waste and recycling centres, which again has been an issue of national controversy, but we've now got an effective booking system working there, and that system is working effectively across the whole of the county, given the challenges that were in that service. The section also describes the work we've done to keep the highways operating and preparing for the increasing use of transport and traffic which we're seeing around us even as we speak. Sections 49 on paragraph 49 onwards talks about CCBS, and I think what is notable about that section is the full range of services that sit within the CCBS department. The fantastic work that was done to wind those services down carefully and gradually, or urgently as the needs arose at the beginning of the crisis, but the gradual reopening of those services, including for libraries in the last couple of weeks, as we've moved forward. And the panoply of service arrangements going through CCBS, I think, speaks for itself. Paragraph 68 shows the work that's been done through corporate resources, through IT in particular, to keep us working at home effectively, and also through the IBC to make sure that we're continuing to pay people and our providers and suppliers effectively, which is such an important dimension to economic progress. Section 77 talks about the important issues to do with communications and particularly the briefings that we've managed. And finally, section 78 touches upon the work that we're doing individually as a local authority and in partnership with our local resilience framework partners across the Hampshire and Isle of Wight area to prepare for recovery, not just in service terms, but also particularly in terms of economic activity. And members will note that the report which is following on today's agenda includes reference to the remodelling of the existing subcommittee for economic activity in the county to focus on that recovery journey as well. I would finally like to add, in response to Councillor House's fair comment about how we learn, that undoubtedly my confidence in this organisation around the learning that we take to everything is working through thoroughly. We have a very strong emergency network working with our partners, and that is constantly considering the evidence and constantly remodelling our approach to the crisis in order that we can learn accordingly. But undoubtedly, as we move forward, there will be more to be done to understand how we've worked with this crisis. Thank you very much for hearing me out, Chairman. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Chairman, would you like me to answer the question regarding telephony?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I can draw your attention to page 43 of, page 43 of the report, and it's paragraphs 72 and 73. What it talks about is, as you know, we have Hants Direct in Fareham, which is a large contact centre. It works on old telephony, which cannot be redirected to be operated from staff working in a home setting. It can only be used with staff coming into the Fareham building. We're at the outbreak of COVID in the final stages of procuring a new telephony service, and it will be implemented and live by the end of September, which will allow us to then operate on home telephony. In the intervening period, we identified the essential contact for telephony in children's, adults, and registration. And that is continuing with our staff going into the Hants Direct building in Fareham. All other non-essential lines, and they're listed there in terms of general inquiries, school admissions, blue badge, concessionary travel, libraries, all of the general type inquiries are not operating through telephony. They are operating with staff working at home, dealing with online inquiries, and of course we are still dealing with paperwork. So if anybody doesn't have online, can't get through on the telephone, they can of course send a letter in the normal manner, and our staff who are in the building will deal with that letter. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. I've got so far 4 members of my cabinet that wish to speak. I'll do them in the order that I can see written in front of me. Councillor Reid, Steve Reid.
Thank you, Leader. It's just a brief comment really about the perfectly valid point that Keith House made about learning. I think as councillors we have to be very careful how we ask questions and make comments, because it's very easy to focus on the negative and not the positive. Now, obviously, in the learning point of view, there will be things that we will identify that might have gone better or could go better in the future. We should also, though, include in learning the things that have gone well and the way in which they have been deployed to good effect. So, for example, I think at the start of COVID, nobody would have expected our IT department to respond as positively as it did in setting up meetings like these, and nobody would have expected the councillors and the general public to respond as positively as they have in making meetings like these work. The gold-silver structure that the Chief Executive has been heavily involved in, I think, have been extremely effective, and the report details dozens of areas where good work has been done and could be incorporated in our new normal after the COVID pandemic has been put behind us. So when we talk about learning, let's learn the positives as well as the negatives. And as councillors, let's talk about the positives as well as the negatives, because there's a lot of them.
Thank you very much, Steve. Sean, Councillor Woodward.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. I just wanted to pay tribute to the officers who've been bringing back the various services which people enjoy out in the countryside, our outdoor centres, our country parks, registrations, etc. But I wanted to pay particular tribute to the library service staff, because they really carried on almost without a break. Okay, they weren't able to open physical buildings, but we've had staff delivering baby rhyme time and lots of other activities online through social media, which I know have been hugely enjoyed. Hampshire now enjoys, I think it's almost the biggest digital library service in the country. Fantastic amount of work done there. I think we saw in the period of a year, and this was even not including when we moved to the COVID pandemic, a doubling from 500,000 to 1 million online lens. So the library service is transforming before our eyes, and I really do want to pay a fulsome tribute to the library staff who have put all the work in they have, and now to bring the libraries back online physically as well. It's a very different experience of people visiting, but they are getting a fantastic welcome, and physical book borrowing is now moving forward as well. So I just wanted to put that on record, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Sean. Judith Grajewski.
Thank you, Leader. May I add my thanks to Mr. Coughlin for this report, which captures, I think, the key points of the progress that has been made in dealing with the pandemic. Unprecedented is the word used in the report, and that's almost an understatement. The responses have had to be bold, innovative and rapid, and the pace, I think, has been breathtaking. I also want to place on record my thanks to our Director of Public Health, Simon Bryant, who continues to work tirelessly, or so it would seem, for his leadership, not just within the County Council, but within the LRF and on the Isle of Wight, and the many committees he chairs or advises. And at the same time, never forgetting the whole public health team supporting the COVID work, who are also getting on with the day job, if I can put it that way, of delivering a wide range of public health services to Hampshire residents who rely on them every day. We've talked a little bit about recovery, and if I can refer to Councillor House's point about learning, the team is already doing that and working on the recovery with the aim to build back better. I welcome the Outbreak Control Plan, which, as mentioned in paragraph 19, is going to enable effective local management and a targeted and almost refined approach to controlling the virus. And finally, can I take this opportunity to make the point that for all of us, for this to work, we all have to play our part if the virus is to be controlled, and getting on with recovery through the easing of lockdown, yes, is crucial, but the virus is still among us. And paragraph 18 reminds us that the 2-metre social distancing rule is still in place. And in fact, I looked at the government website again last night, and it's one of the top 5 points on the website, alongside stay at home as much as possible, work from home if you can, limit contact with other people, and wash your hands regularly. So thank you for letting me get those points in, Chairman. And because in my view, it's doing all of this that will give us the best chance of controlling the virus and minimising outbreaks. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. You're absolutely right. It's a multifaceted way we fight the virus. There is not one single thing we do that is the most important. There's a variety of things. You're absolutely right. Andrew, Councillor Joy.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I echo the very supportive and congratulatory comments that the colleagues have made, and I'm not going to repeat them, but I would like to make a few brief comments. Councillor House drew, I think quite rightly, our attention to the concept of learning. But the fact of the matter is that actually the County Council is an operational organisation. And what we've actually seen over the last few months is its ability to operate essentially in what is more or less a wartime setting. The war has been against an unseen enemy, and its adaptability and flexibility has been absolutely astonishing by any standard. As far as learning is concerned, yes, we've learned a great deal as this has gone through, councillors and officers alike. But of course, through the Local Resilience Forum, and particularly an area that I'm familiar with, which is emergency planning, that is a constant learning exercise. And what we can't implement now, we will certainly implement later. So I pay a huge tribute to the operational performance of the council as a whole, and I particularly congratulate the Chief Executive, without whom the steering and leadership alongside ourselves would not have been of the same standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Liz, Councillor Fairhurst.
Thank you, Keith. Councillor House, I'd just like to inform you that we are actually undertaking an internal review of all our HCC care homes, and the Hampshire Adult Safeguarding Board has commissioned a learning review of what has been happening. And we also have the Care Home Support Board, which includes the Hampshire Care Association, which I'm very pleased to say Graham Allen chairs, are also looking into this matter. So we are learning lessons. We are looking at what we could do better next time, if anything. And I'd also like to just say thank you, on top of everyone else's thanks, but in particular to our care workers, who actually went above and beyond throughout this crisis to deliver the most excellent care to residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I've got no more hands up. I'd just like to add my thanks both to all the staff at the County Council who've done a tremendous job while we've been operating online over the last 3 months. And also, I think, those communities across our county that have just got on with the job and helped each other. I think you remember at the beginning of this crisis, I said there's one objective, and that is to reduce the spread of the virus. And in order to do that, we need to all work together. And thirdly, we need to look after each other. And what's been particularly notable in the county is all those voluntary groups and the parish councils and the people working in the communities have been working together and looking after each other. So if I can now move to the recommendations, there are 3 recommendations at paras 2, 3 and 4. Can I have your agreement to those recommendations by putting your hands up? Thank you all very much. Those recommendations are agreed unanimously. Now moving on to the Hampshire Local Outbreak Plan and Local Outbreak Engagement Board, item 7 on our agenda. I think I'm right in saying that Simon Bryant will be dealing with this particular subject and introducing it to the Cabinet before we look at the recommendations. The Director of Public Health, Simon Bryant, please.
Many thanks, Leader. It gives me great pleasure to present this paper, building on the Director of Public Health responsibilities that I had anyway. And this paper sets out the governance and arrangements for managing the pandemic and our response locally going forward. In paragraph 16, you have set out the outbreak plan structure, which we have discussed previously, setting out those themes that we need to oversee as part of the outbreak plan. So care homes and schools, high-risk places, locations and communities, the local testing capacity, contact tracing, data integration, and vulnerable people. The final theme that we need to oversee is the governance and the local board. So in paragraph 22, it sets out the governance structure for managing the local outbreak, connecting with both the Gold Command, as previously mentioned, the Cabinet, the Local Outbreak Engagement Board, and the LRF. In paragraph 25, there is discussion on what the Local Outbreak Engagement Board will be doing as a formal subcommittee of the Cabinet, with the membership there as detailed, and also how we will invite other members to be part of that meeting. Paragraph 30 sets out the Local Health Protection Board, which I will be chairing, and that will have strategic oversight for health protection regarding coronavirus in Hampshire. Thinking also about prevention, surveillance, planning and response. All those are really key if we are to control this virus locally. Paragraph 32 and 33 sets out the powers that we already have and how we will link with government should we need to take further action, such as in Leicester. And finally, in paragraphs 34 to 37, a short paragraph on the budget, because the County Council has been given £4.7 million grant to support this work, which we fully welcome, which will enable us to deliver this work really effectively. And also in terms of the governance, slightly aside, but this paper also sets out the setting up of another subcommittee on economic development, as you said, Leader. The importance of economic development at this time to mirror managing the pandemic is really key. So the recommendations in paragraph 5 ask the Cabinet to endorse the steps to establish the local outbreak control plan for Hampshire, to approve the local outbreak engagement board, to approve the establishment of the health protection board, and delegate responsibility to me to spend the funding as appropriate in consultation with the Chief Executive. And then also approves the change of name from the Advisory Subcommittee on Economic Development to the Subcommittee on Economic Growth and Recovery. I think just following the conversation earlier, would it be helpful if I talk something about the data now, or do you want to pause and take questions?
No, I'd be very happy, Simon, if you give us a bit more about the data now, yes.
It's a really helpful question you raised, and I think we've seen nationally a number of questions about what data is available. I'm really pleased to say that now that I have data on all tests taking place, so all the positives, and we've seen a couple of weeks ago the number of cases in Hampshire looked like to increase because now we have published all test data. That's anything undertaken in the NHS or in those mobile units or the settings that you've seen set up and established around Hampshire. So that's really positive. I get details of all outbreaks and incidents that are taking place in particular settings that I've outlined earlier in the paper. So the high-risk settings or care homes or schools. I'm just really careful to mention we get details of incidents. That might be one case that causes a little bit of action to be needed to be taken, or an outbreak, which is 2 or more cases. Finally, we are getting test and trace data. So we're getting details of those people, the percentage of people being contacted following being identified as a positive, and the number of people who are being followed up as their contacts. So that's really good, and we get a really good uptake of that. We don't get 100% of people being contacted as expected, but we do very, very well. We have 92% of contacts being contacted in Hampshire, and that's well above the national average. We're beginning to get the location data. It seems to come in not as smooth as you might like, but we're getting location data now, and we need to carefully manage that, because where someone lives doesn't necessarily mean that's where they caught the virus, and we just need to manage that really carefully. But we're working through that, and we're working with Public Health England to ensure that that data is well well able to help us to support the pandemic. And we look at various sources of data working with Public Health England. So should there be any untoward increase in cases in a location, we are able to monitor that, look at that, investigate and take any action should that be required. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Simon. Have any of my Cabinet colleagues got comments or questions? Okay, well, I think we can move straight to the recommendations, which are at paras 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. Are you all in agreement with the recommendations? Thank you very much. I've got a unanimous number of hands once again, which is very encouraging. Thank you very much, Simon. And let us move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the medium-term financial strategy.
Thank you,
I
Leader.
think I'm right in saying the Director of Resources, Caroline. Over to you.
Thank you, Leader, colleagues. As you can see at the top of the paper, it's very clear that it was valid as at the 1st of July, and that became extremely important considering that the government made an announcement the very next day on the 2nd of July on further government funding. As yet, we do not have the detail for Hampshire. It is expected this week. The new government funding will be a share of 500 million. Now, considering the 2 previous allocations were 1.6 billion each, this is a significantly lesser sum of money for allocation, and we don't know the distribution methodology that will be used. There is also comment within the announcement about income loss support, but again, depending on the definition of the calculation, we may end up with a 0 allocation, or we may end up with a small sum of money. In either event, our estimation is that the best case from the 2nd of July announcement could be in the order of £12 million. Our worst case could be in the order of £7.5 million. It's clear, therefore, that the additional funding will not substantially change nor improve our overall financial position, albeit the additional funding is to be welcomed. So as soon as I have an update, I'll be able to provide that as a briefing note. And just secondly, the next MHCLG return is due at the end of July. And again, that is usually the next stage of the government considering any future funding allocations. So if we turn back to the paper, I'll try to lead you through the main points. Page 76, para 56 shows the table which compares the first 2 MHCLG returns. We had to complete one as at the end of May, which went to the May Cabinet, and one in June. And you can see there was very relatively little change between the 2, but the bottom line on the June return was 137 million of financial consequences. If we then follow that story, because that starts with what do MHCLG want to know, and they have a very clear definition on what we return to them, and it's not the whole picture. So the rest of the report then develops onwards from that picture. So if you look at page 79, at the top of the page, it builds, starting with 137 million, adding the market underwriting and saw a loss of savings for the next 2 years that we have, and then identifying to date the sums of money that we can allocate against those extraordinary costs, giving a bottom line unfunded costs and losses of 102 million. Moving then to page 89, at paragraph 123, you can then see the accumulation of those figures. So the net unfunded costs and losses at 102 million on the far right-hand side, and that's building the 3-year horizon. What you then have seen within the report was an assessment of further departmental pressures, our assessment of loss of business rates and council tax, and a small number of other pressures, which brings us to total cost, losses and pressures of just over 210 million. And that's on a one-off basis. What we were therefore looking at 124, we're trying to predict 3 potential scenarios, particularly regarding where the government may go with additional funding. So you can see scenario 1 is no additional funding, and that was as at the 1st of July. No underwrite of council tax or business rates. Scenario 2 has further government funding being allocated to meet all of our COVID response, recovery and demand costs, and that would be an extra 17.8 million, but no underwrite for council tax and business rates. And then the third scenario is further government funding to meet all of the response and demand costs and the underwriting of that council tax and business rates. In none of the scenarios have we assumed that income losses beyond council tax and business rates, future year costs or lost savings will be covered by the government. That's a necessarily prudent position to take in terms of trying to assess the council's financial sustainability, and it's certainly not a time for us to be optimistic in our forecasting. If I then take you over the page to page 91, para 130, what we then had to do, understanding the potential top-line costs, is look at the available resources that could be called upon in this emergency situation should the government not then look to address fully the financial consequences. And as you can see, we started by looking at corporate reserves that were not currently allocated for investment and development initiatives, albeit the use of these reserves will affect our usage in the future. So the Invest to Save, corporate policy and organisational development reserves have all been utilised in each of these scenarios. We then looked at the general capital reserve, which we can use, but it has a revenue implication in that we would then have to borrow for those capital expenditures. The general fund balance, which then needs to be put back in place because that is a working balance of resources that is used in times of significant issue, which we have at the moment, but would need to be budgeted to be built back up again. And the budget bridging reserve, again, we could use that short term, but it would have to be replenished because we need that for our successor transformation programmes. So the table at 135 really presents the variables and shows that for scenarios 1, we do not have sufficient funding to bridge that gap. Scenario 2, we have to eat significantly into the general fund reserve. And scenario 3, we have to eat significantly into the general capital. And therefore, page 92, para 141 is very clear that, not surprisingly, in face of a potential £200 million impact, the council is not financially sustainable in 3 out of the 4 scenarios. It is possible under scenario 3 that we would be able to stay on track, but that would be dependent on 2 further elements of government funding. And irrespective of that, we would be leaving ourselves extremely exposed to any shocks in the system, because basically that is using up any and all available resource in combating COVID. At Para 144, it is clear that the government needs to honour the commitment that it made in meeting the full financial consequences of COVID. That talks about a revenue position. We then have to look quickly at capital, Para 147. Our intention had been to bring forward investment priorities for capital. That doesn't appear appropriate just now because of the financial challenges we are facing, but also in light of many of the challenges we've had to face during COVID, there is a question about what the new future will look like and what the new operating models will look like, particularly around care homes and office accommodation. And therefore, the aim is to bring something back in September, albeit if there are any capital projects that we do need to address for health and safety related reasons, clearly they will progress. And in order that existing schemes that are already in progress are not halted as a result of revised cost estimates through COVID changing in working arrangements, this report seeks approval for a capital underwriting of up to £5 million, and that's laid out at paragraph 154 on page 94. So looking at beyond 2022-23, if I take you to the top of page 96, you can see presented two potential timetables. At this point, we would have normally been starting to look at a transformation to 23, projections and timelines and activity. Bearing in mind that for many aspects of transformation to 21 and the remainder of transformation to 2019, those projects are paused and we need to look to reinstate them as early as possible. It seems that our best attempt should be to try and buy ourselves an extra year and look at transformation to 2024. We can only do that if we have enough financial firepower in order to cash flow an additional year. And as you know, each year costs us around about 40 million. Therefore, we've built in two timetables, and the time to look at that will be February 2021 when we come to budget setting. We'll have a far better idea around government funding for COVID and also around the 1 year settlement that we expect to get for next year. Again, it's highly likely that the financial review will be delayed yet again in terms of the fair funding review and business rates retention. If we do have the appropriate wherewithal to aim towards a transformation to 2024, then the balance we'd be looking at would be 120 million as opposed to 80 million, but we would have an extra year in order to develop plans and proposals. And you can see at paragraph 165, if it is a 2-year programme, the allocation of that 80 million of savings across our departments. And then the final section, starting page 97, is about financial resilience and sustainability. And you can see at para 167, financial resilience generally describes the ability of our local authority to remain viable, stable and effective in the medium to long term in the face of pressures from growing demand, tightening funding and increasingly complex and unpredictable financial environment. And what we need to think about is the medium term, irrespective of the fact that we are in a short-term crisis, which could continue. The government at the moment is looking at the current year, not the next 2 years, but you have to look at the medium term. So discussions have been ongoing about what's referred to as a Section 114 notice, and at present additional guidance has been built in to require the Chief Financial Officer to consult with government prior to issuing any such notice. And what I would say is at this stage, we need to wait for further information, particularly around further government decisions on grant being made available. The aim would be to continue to report to Cabinet and County Council on the ongoing position, and if something changes detrimentally, then obviously members will be notified immediately. It is fast moving and changing consequences as part of the crisis, and therefore we do need to continue to allow government time to hopefully make good on their commitment. Therefore, should action be needed, I would expect that we would be doing as we usually do as a good organisation that has strong financial resilience and good budget management. that we'll be working with Cabinet and County Council in dealing with changes to the financial landscape. A Section 114 would certainly be a last resort action if the authority was not taking appropriate action, and therefore I think we are still some way off of having to take that particular action. Chairman, I hope that's an appropriate run through the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Very appropriate and very thorough. It does show what the pandemic has done to our robust finances. And indeed, it's just as well they were robust at the beginning of the pandemic, because it's allowed us to actually ride the storm, as it were. But nonetheless, the medium-term prospects are not brilliant unless government understands exactly where the pressures are with local government. Now, I rather ran ahead of myself. Sorry about that. I rather ran ahead of myself. I should have asked Councillor Keith House to speak before Carolyn. Councillor House, Keith, would you like to speak now? My apologies.
No, thank you very much, Keith. That could have been the Chancellor on the phone offering some money. So maybe you should have taken the call.
I can assure you, if it was, I would have cut you all off just to speak to him.
Well, I'm quite reassured in that case. I do try and stand back from some of these papers in terms of to just look at the bigger picture a little bit, because we know that the staff do an absolutely fantastic job at managing the council's finances, and this is again yet another very thorough report. And I'd like to thank Carolyn and Rob and the whole team for everything they've done to put this together, because it is a pretty impossible situation. Carolyn quite politely calls it fast moving, which is probably the best possible description you could give at the moment. But standing back was where we were at just 3 months ago, when we were told very, very clearly by the Chancellor and by the Secretary of State, spend whatever you need to spend, dear local government, and we'll make sure you're not out of pocket. Now, I think we've got some soothsayers somewhere, because all the indications are at the moment that that simply isn't going to happen, and we're not going to be reimbursed for all of the additional costs. We've already been told that in terms of lost income, well, actually, it's take 5% off, then 70% of that will fund you. So there's a gap already, let alone all of the extremely high additional costs that we've had to incur alongside lost income. So I'll come to a question in a bit, but the headline figures I think are really stark. £103 million currently down the Swanee, £120 million of new cuts over the next 3 years. 3 out of 4 scenarios on paragraph 22 in bold type, the county council is not considered to be financially viable. Paragraph 51, nearly £200 million saving programme. These are really stark figures. We have in previous debates, when we've been looking at the medium-term budget strategy, already been advised us twice that in the long term, if current local government funding arrangements continue, then the county council is not financially viable. So in some sense, there's nothing new. What is new is that we've got less certainty over future income. We've got less certainty about how future costs are going to be met. And we've got no certainty the government is going to honour its commitment to refund those additional costs. If we looked at the 3 scenarios in paragraph 22, if I had to guess, I'd say we're probably going to end up somewhere between scenario 2 and scenario 3. We're not going to get bailed out for everything, but we'll get a bit more back than we currently have at the moment. And that still puts us probably on the edge of whether we're financially viable in the short to medium term, and only time will tell on that. So my question, Chairman, has to be the one that I've asked before at Council, and I have to say, to be honest, I've not had a satisfactory response to, which is, what is the Conservative Party doing? What is the Conservative Party going to do to properly make sure that local government is properly funded for the services that we need? Adult social care is in a mess still. We know that we are still having to cut services that we've managed to run as a community for over 100 years for the benefit of our local residents, and yet we're now saying suddenly we're broke. It's not just about Brexit. There's a whole stack of issues behind this, but fundamentally, local government is not being properly funded. What is your party going to do about it, Chairman?
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate your question. You won't be surprised if I don't give you a straight answer now. Clearly, this is a very difficult situation financially for the country, and I think not a lot would be different if your party or the Labour Party or a coalition of 2 or 3 of us were in power, I think we'd still be in a very difficult position as to how you actually balance the books and provide the support that the different parts of society, both in the private and the public sector, require to get back to some sort of normality. All I can tell you is we're fighting as hard as we can as a group of county councillors, unitary councils, and indeed district and borough councils to ensure that government understand the huge burden that this pandemic has put upon us and the huge amount of work that has been done by local government at all levels over the last 3 months to counter the worst effects of the pandemic and now help with the recovery. Now, I'd like to ask my Cabinet colleagues if they have anything to add. To start off with, I'd like to ask Steve Reid, Councillor Steve Reid, for a contribution.
Yes, thank you, Leader, and congratulations to Keith on managing to extract the political dimension of an actual COVID crisis. But I'll try and answer the question, because Keith said, what are we going to do as Conservatives about the situation that we face? And the answer is, in the short term, we're going to make the best possible decisions we can to protect the health of the people who live in the Hampshire area who we represent. So we'll make the best decisions we possibly can. And in the medium term, with the amount of uncertainty that there is, all we can do is to play out what the possible scenarios are, which the director has very competently done in the paper, and react to whatever reality is put in our way. And that is really all we can say, because the situation is so fast moving. And, you know, in a way, the most telling point of the director's paper was the very first one, written in red, valid as of 1st of July. Because the situation is so fast moving, we just have to react to whatever happens. Now, if we put this in context, there's something on which Councillor House was absolutely right. Up to the end of last year, and we'll get this in the report to come, we were on track to meet our budget. We were bringing in the financial situation a smidgen below what we had budgeted. So we were on track, and we were on the right side of on track, finishing off last year's finances. And then the COVID lockdown has changed everything. And as the director has said, without government support to meet the costs of its decisions, because it was the government's decision to do the lockdown, and I'm not saying it was a wrong decision, it was the government, however, that did it, Hampshire County Council's position is weakened to the point where in some of the scenarios the director has looked at, we are no longer financially viable. As Keith said, the long-term position, even before COVID, was such that we were going to be in a difficult situation. We couldn't carry on forever as we were, but COVID has really accelerated that problem. So we're £100 million down in round figures, and each month that goes on, that is likely to increase. So where do we go? I'm particularly concerned about the loss of operational income, and I phrase that very carefully. The government, I think, is concerned with those councils who have made direct investments for investment purposes in, say, commercial properties, and may now be losing commercial income. We have lost operational income as well. Thankfully, we always went for pooled investments on property to spread the risk, and wasn't that a good decision? So well done to the director for advice on that one. But we've also lost operational income, and the obvious example, which is easy to understand, is that when we have to close the car parks in our country parks because we don't want people touching the machines, that is a loss of operational income. And I mentioned the investment income, and thankfully we went for the pooled investments. What we have to do now is to lobby. we have got to explain to the government the very serious situation that we now face. It's really disappointing, but I suppose inevitable, that we will now have another 1-year settlement, because I was looking forward to the fair funding review and a 3-year rolling settlement that would enable us to forecast much better in which direction we were going. But I can understand that the government is going to find it extremely difficult to deliver on that. So we're in a precarious situation, and the director has told us that exactly that. We are in a precarious situation. All we can do is to model what the risks are, to make the best possible decisions we can, and to lobby the government to deliver on its promise of spend the money up front, we will let you get it back. And if they do honour that, we will be in a stronger position than we might be. And always remember one thing: Hampshire County Council was one of the most financially strong councils in the country. And we are using that strength to dig into our reserves, to see us through the immediate crisis, to do what has to be done. I don't think that the government can let the whole of the local government sector go to the wall. It has got to deliver on its promise. But what I don't want to see is Hampshire being punished for past prudence in having the reserves, and therefore they find a formula which means that we don't get reimbursed in full. So it's a difficult situation, but Hampshire must be better placed than hundreds of other councils to get through this.
Steve, thank you very much. And I entirely agree with your comments about us being prudent in the past, so we were able to meet the demands of the pandemic in a more effective way than many other councils. But I do not believe that we should be punished, as you rightly point out, by getting less support from the government than would otherwise be the case. So thank you for that. Are there any other comments from my Cabinet colleagues? Okay, can I ask you all to agree the recommendations in paras 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11. The ones at 11 are recommendations to the County Council under subparagraphs A, B and C. And I see you've all voted very quickly. Thank you very much. Those recommendations are approved, and including the one to the County Council itself that meets, as you know, later this week. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, if I can find it. And I think we're staying with the Director of Corporate Resources, Carolyn, for the end of year financial report.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'll be very swift with this one. As Councillor Reid highlighted in his comments regarding the previous report, the end-year report is very positive. Prior to COVID, we were exhibiting the strong financial grip that, as an organisation, we are used to exhibiting. At 2.2 on page 126, you can see that the net service cash limit expenditure was some 7.2 million lower than expected, but against an overall gross budget of 2 billion, that's a variance of some 0.4%. In the adults and children's services areas, they are showing a zero balance, and that is simply reflecting the sustained management activity in both areas in dealing with significant demand and other pressures, counteracted by the use of corporate contingencies. In economy, transport and environment, you can see 1.8 million showing there, and that is primarily due to savings being delivered as planned in advance. Just to highlight that the saving on the winter maintenance budget will be carried forward in line with council policy and topped up to a value of £2 million. For policy and resources, the main aspect there is related to delivering the partnership with the 3 London boroughs early, and therefore achieving those contributions earlier than was necessary for budgetary purposes. And then at paragraph 213, you can see the non-cash limit budgets totaling just 11.9 million. Again, a relatively small sum of money, but a very important sum of money, and primarily due to the management of our cash balances, internal borrowing, and small amounts of unused contingency. And in line with council policy, these will be carried across to the budget bridging reserve. Prior to COVID, that would have been to support our medium-term financial strategy that was approved in November 2019. But as you understand now from the previous report, this will also be important in assisting with short-term cash flow resulting from COVID. Chairman, that was all I wanted to draw attention to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. I'll mention something now that I perhaps should have mentioned at the beginning of the previous item, and that is really just focusing once again on the strength of our financial position at the beginning of the pandemic. It did allow us to do certain things that were not open to other county councils, specifically when we were offered by government, I think it was £18.3 million to passport on to care homes for the problems that they were having as a result of the lack of PPE and other matters. We were able to agree to pass on that money before we'd actually received it from the Chancellor of the Exchequer. When we knew we were going to get it, we immediately passed on a significant amount of that total directly to care homes, some of whom were in dire straits. And I think that was something that we were able to do as a result of our strong financial position at the beginning of the pandemic, bearing in mind the end of the financial year results that we've just heard. And on that point, are there any comments from my colleagues on the Cabinet about this particular item, the end of year financial report? Okay. Do you all agree the recommendations at, if I can find them, recommendations at at paragraph 1, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, A and B. The B, and A again for the recommendation to the County Council under 1.4. Thank you all very much. Right, we move now straight on to the climate change strategy. And before we start, and I ask Stuart Jarvis, the Director of ETE, to speak, and Tricia from the department as well, I'd like to ask Councillor Todd to make his short presentation.
Thank you, Leader, and thank you very much indeed for your commitment in keeping this project moving and consistently keeping it on the Cabinet's agenda, despite what the earlier part of this meeting made clear to be extremely challenging times for everyone in local government. That said, you may have seen the cartoon which shows the 3 waves of crisis approaching us at the moment. The first wave being COVID, the second larger wave being the economic crisis, and then the third even larger wave being the climate emergency. And so it's right that this gets priority. And there's also no strategy or plan that can't be improved through a bit of what I hope will be constructive challenge. And there are 4 areas which I'd like to bring to Cabinet's attention. Firstly, urgency. Secondly, what it will actually take to get behaviour change. Thirdly, governance. And fourthly, the supporting strategies and whether they're supportive at all. Now, in earlier discussions, I made it clear that I had concerns about urgency in the 2050 deadline. And I'm slightly concerned that that lack of ambition may be feeding through to the plan in 2 aspects. Firstly, I get concerned and slightly suspicious when I see a flat line on progress showing equal progress every 5 years, because all the evidence for change programs is that they tend to slow down over time as change gets harder and the earlier wins come faster. So I do think that if we are going to achieve the target by 2050, we need to show faster progress in the earlier years and not an equal rate of progress across all the years. And I think if we were doing that, we might see it reflect through in some of the actions that are highlighted. So, for example, I was having a look at some of the actions, I think they're in Appendix 2, and it was looking at renewable energy for schools, and it used the word optional. It looked at using 100% renewable energy for the HCC estate, and it talked about 2025. And to me, those are two areas where maybe, firstly, the target that we've set of 2050, and secondly, the equal progress approach that we're taking with the goal setting may not be putting enough pressure on the system for urgent action. The second area I'd like to touch on, and I think it's actually lucky that we have the Director of Public Health in the room, is are we learning the right lessons about behaviour change and properly reflecting them in the strategy? And the research to back is extremely useful because it makes clear that behaviour change is not just going to be about communication, but also the context that people operate in. When it comes to ill health, there's a recognition that ill health is greater in poor communities due to factors like lack of work, education, housing, access to green space, and there's never an implication that it's just from individual failure to act. So the reason why, for example, people may not choose to walk or cycle is not because they're bad people who are making bad decisions, because they have a reasonable fear to use our roads or to ask their children to use our roads in a sustainable way. We can see that from COVID, that when people feel safe to cycle and walk, they cycle and walk. And when they're not cycling, it's not because they don't want to, it's because they don't feel safe to, not because we've not come up with the right argument to persuade them. So we need a public health approach, and we need to recognise that the context, we need to be pulling all our levers to drive behaviour change, reflecting that in the strategy, not just framing it as a communications challenge. The third point I wanted to highlight was governance. It talks about scrutiny having a role in governance, but it hasn't done it, at least not that I'm aware of. Now, given that climate change covers every area of the Council's work, I do think that the next round of this paper does need to go on the agenda of all the relevant committees ahead of committing to the detailed plan. For example, if I'd had a chance to look at it at the Environment, Transport and Economy Committee, I'd have scrutinised or asked questions about the choice of the greening campaign, which was something that was touched on in the deputation. Now, I need to declare a slight interest. I still run a website on the greening campaign, Greening Full Flood, and have done so for about 10 years. So I have a sense of what's worked about it, but also maybe some of the challenges that represent. So one of the questions I would have been asking if we'd had a chance to do scrutiny is, how have they changed? What are they doing that's different and better than 10 years ago? Do they collaborate enough? Are their collaboration skills up to snuff? Do they have the skills to create sustainable organisations? And as was touched on in the deputation, I'm concerned that we're missing out on the existing infrastructure of voluntary groups that have a proven record in this area. And finally, I'd like to talk about the supporting strategies that are highlighted in the detailed overall strategy. So for each of the areas that are highlighted, it uses the word supporting strategy. And these are absolutely vital for mainstreaming the work. But if you just read the presentation, you might be lulled into a sense of security, an unfair sense of security, because many of the strategies are not yet supporting strategies at all. They're at best potentially supporting strategies. So what I think is needed on that is for each one of the strategies to go through and say, do they centre carbon reduction enough? Are they fit for the purpose that we have long term? Red, amber, green, and a timetable to fix them. Let's take two strategies, for example. The Hampshire energy strategy dates from 2012, so relatively recent compared to some of the strategies listed. And yet it doesn't mention hydrogen, and it doesn't question the county's commitment to incineration of waste. And the Hampshire's Joint Municipal Waste Management Strategy dates from 2006. It doesn't mention food waste recycling. And even though there are big discussions about the current waste strategy at the moment, they're generally framed around meeting government requirements and our financial challenges, and not centred on the urgency of our need to cut carbon, although there has been analysis of that as part of the programme. Just to give you a sense of where we are with the Hampshire Joint Municipal Waste Management Strategy and its support for carbon, the current strategy, as in place, doesn't mention the word carbon, doesn't mention the word CO2, and doesn't mention the word climate change anywhere within it. So I welcome that you're talking about the strategy, and I welcome that there's going to be an action plan in September, and I welcome Cabinet's commitment to keeping this project moving. But I do think you need more urgency. I think you need a wider view of behaviour change. I think we need to strengthen the role of scrutiny in terms of how this programme is embedded around the council. and we need an urgent timetable to update and improve the supporting strategies so that they actually help us achieve our carbon targets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Todd, and thank you for keeping us on our toes as regards the climate strategy. I won't try to answer all the points you made, but I would like to just say this, that scrutiny is a matter for the chairman of the scrutiny committees, not me as leader of the county council. I did actually make it, I made a point of speaking to the chair of the P&R scrutiny committee about his role in scrutinizing whether we meet the targets set by the 2050 Commission. And I know he's already done some work on that. But in a sense, you're right. Climate change can be brought up probably right across all the scrutiny committees, but that is a matter for the committees themselves and the chairman as to the priority they give this particular subject. So the second point I'd make is we are making progress. It may not be as quick as you would like, but one thing I can say to you is that the £1 billion made available for energy efficiency, amongst other things, by the government, we have already looked into that to see how we can actually access that particular fund for various projects to improve the efficiency of houses and public buildings within Hampshire. And the final point I'd make would be on hydrogen. You probably know, but it's worth repeating, that part of the huge investment being made by ExxonMobil at Fawley is the provision of a new hydrogen plant, probably initially for the use of cruise ships, where the level of pollution is very high, both in terms of air quality at low level and in terms of CO2 emissions at high level. So with those points in mind, I'd now like to hand over to the Director of ETE, Stuart Jarvis, to comment on the climate change strategy, which is in front of you.
Thank you very much, Leader. I will, shortly, with your permission, invite Chitra to present the report. But I did just want to make two very brief comments in response to Councillor Todd's comments. One is to reassure all members that a huge amount of work is going on looking at policy and strategy, and that is being done very much hand in glove with the select committee process. So, for example, there's been a number of debates about waste policy and the approach to waste, which have taken place in the ETE select committee in recent months. And it is absolutely correct that the joint municipal waste strategy will need to be updated. We recognise that fully, and indeed it will be updated, but we're still waiting consultation from central government on aspects of the national position on that, and we're also in deep and I think fairly intense discussion with our district council colleagues about trying to reboot the waste system in Hampshire generally to improve recycling. And as Councillor Todd was gracious enough to comment, that the work that we've commissioned on that has absolutely included a look at the carbon implications of different collection systems and different approaches. Councillor Todd's also aware that work's going on a refresh of the local transport plan, which is also very much centred around the sort of clean air agenda and reducing carbon and more active transport. So I completely accept that those strategies are not in place yet, but there is a lot of work going on at the moment to bring those about. And as you said, Chairman, there has also been discussion at the P&R Select Committee based on the Hampshire 2050 work, but very much picking up a central theme there around climate change and the response to the climate emergency. But with those comments complete, Chairman, I'd like, if I may, to hand over to Chitra and ask her to present the report. And Chitra and I will then be ready to answer any questions that members may have.
Thank you, Stuart. Chitra, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. So I'm just going to run through the report quickly, starting with paragraph 6. We are about a year after we declared a climate emergency, and the strategy that's set out here is how we're going to meet the 2 targets that we set in June last year, which was the target to be carbon neutral by 2050 and to build resilience to a 2-degree rise in temperature, which I believe is quite a unique thing as a local authority to have those two targets. Most only have one for emissions. It is a significant milestone for us, but it's also quite important in terms of setting the direction for the council, but also for our public sector partners, residents and businesses. And obviously, as stated throughout the strategy, it will require support from national government. So the strategy as set out in paragraph 9 sets out our carbon emissions baseline, which we work with the Carbon Trust to produce. That carbon emissions baseline does include all GHG emissions. It's not just carbon, but that's the way the language is kind of held. It also sets out the carbon budget pathway to 2050. And as was pointed out, that is a straight line. Again, we're trying to align ourselves with the way in which all other local authorities in the country have established their baselines and budgets. So this is just the accepted methodology that we're using. And as stated in the strategy, where we can, we will accelerate. So you'll see that the figures in paragraph 10 outline where the emissions come from, also noting in paragraph 12 that industry and commerce is the highest. And however, as a local authority, we do recognize that transport and residential are really the areas we need to focus on, having the most influence on those areas. But we will certainly be working in partnership with industry and commerce to understand how we can help reduce those emissions there. So the strategy very much is based on the Hampshire 2050 Commission of Inquiry final report, which went to Extraordinary Council in September last year. So a lot of the front of that strategy, the policy, the approach, etc., are based on that. The strategy is also based upon a set of key principles which underpins the approach that the council will take. For example, things like co-benefits, and quite important in the current climate, looking at proportionate, affordable, equitable, so making sure that the social justice element is also picked up, and also recognising some of those points about national government funding, which Chairman you mentioned already. The strategy is very much focused, as stated on paragraph 16, around the key sectors that contribute to emissions. So many of those are things that you would expect to see, but obviously energy generation, distribution, that local energy element, quite important. So making sure that we kind of cover all the key areas of emissions. So just quickly to go through paragraph 23, the next stage will be looking at how we actually meet the 2050 target that we've set. So the appendix 2 is only the kind of current activities that are taking place. What we are going to be doing between now and September is assessing that pipeline of projects, but also looking at what other projects are ongoing within Hampshire and within the County Council, and then understanding how we're going to bridge that gap. And that gap will be essentially the main part of the new action plan that will then be presented back to Cabinet later this year in September. Also, as stated in paragraph 27, we'll be bringing forward the 2 decision-making tools to help assess the carbon and resilience impact for all key decisions. So that's also in development. So just very quickly to go through from paragraph 30 onwards, as I said, we are focusing very much on residential and transport emissions. And as Stuart mentioned, the LTP is being reviewed. So a lot of activity on transport. The climate change team has been focused on residential. Just to quickly say about the greening campaign, that is one way in which we're engaging with residents. And it was something that the districts and the parish councils were very keen for us to roll out across the county. So we are supporting that with the districts and with the parishes, but it's by no means the only way in which we will engage with community groups. And as stated already, we are having a big stakeholder engagement event, which Councillor Warwick will be chairing on the 6th of August. And we've invited over 40 groups from across Hampshire, representing different elements of climate change, but also wider community areas. So we are definitely wanting to engage wider than just with the greening campaign. Very briefly, the Behavioural Insights work is a really comprehensive report highlighting the public's willingness to change, motivations, barriers, all stated in paragraph 38. Again, this will be taken as a measured approach. We will not be taking action because of some of the barriers. It's just understanding how we communicate, how we market, and also aligning our communications with particular actions or particular forms of activity. For example, if we were consulting on the LTP, then we would be talking about particular communications around that. Today we're launching 3 projects which also fit around the whole community resilience, community energy area. So very briefly, we've got a telephone and online service, and that's very much aimed at everyone who wants to take advantage of any opportunities, particularly like the government funding that's just been announced, to give them somewhere that they can go for advice that they can trust. We're trying to establish a community energy network, which will help to create that network of experts across Hampshire, some of it was mentioned in some of the deputations. So trying to connect those communities that have that expertise to be able to help others. And finally, a targeted solar buying scheme for a select number of Hampshire residents. Finally, I think just to highlight that, as I said, the action plan in Appendix 2 is really just to show the range and depth of activity taking place, but it's by no means the final action plan. And finally, just to go through to the end of the conclusions, paragraph 70 onwards. I think, again, just to reiterate that this strategy provides a clear framework. Obviously, we will be constantly reviewing and monitoring this alongside all of the actions to make sure that they're up to date and relevant. And Councillor Jan Warwick will also have a kind of key role in supporting this work. And I think also to briefly mention that we do recognise that the recovery from COVID is a real opportunity to maximise climate change and sustainability in what's been called green recovery. And Chairman, you will be hosting a Hampshire 2050 partnership event next week on this with all the leaders and chief execs of most of the public sector across Hampshire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chitra. Very encouraging report, may I say. And can I ask my Cabinet colleagues if they have anything to say? Councillor Humby. Rob.
Thank you very much, Chairman. First of all, I'd just like to thank Stuart and particularly Chitra and her team for the enormous amount of work they've done in a relatively short space of time. It is a huge document, but over that time they've made a tremendous amount of progress. If it's okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll just make a brief comment and then perhaps with your permission invite Councillor Jan Warwick, who is leading on climate change, to make a comment as well. Just a brief comment that the strategy has been developed using a very robust evidence-based approach to ensure that we're looking at the right areas and the right topics. And the work by the Carbon Trust has provided a much more robust and detailed breakdown specifically for Hampshire, and that's based on local figures. Industry and commerce, interestingly, has emerged as the largest source of emissions in Hampshire, closely followed by transport and then the residential sector. As a local authority, the biggest influence that we can have on emissions is in transport and residential sectors, but by working in partnership, we can see how we can influence working with the industry and commercial sector. At that point, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to note also we have a paper following this on Transport for South East, and I'll make a few comments at that point on how we're joining up transport and infrastructure along with the work that we're doing on climate change. The strategy is underpinned by a key set of principles, and those principles and policies and will sort of direct how we go forward in terms of working alongside our partners as well. And those principles, or some examples of those principles, are co-benefits. We need to make sure we prioritise actions that deliver multiple benefits for all our communities, such as congestion and air quality and improving health and economic growth. But everything has to be proportionate, affordable and equitable. So we also recognise our role in society in delivering those public services for good for everybody. And clearly an important part of that will be digital and innovation. And we recognise absolutely that technology as an enabler could deliver a significant step change towards those and how we reduce our carbon and make Hampshire resilient. So the strategy is focused around key sectors. So we have our residential, as we mentioned, transport and energy that contribute to emissions. And where resilience needs to be built, the priorities with each of these sectors are covered in the strategy. So where we go next, the next step is to produce a robust action plan on that strategy. And at that point, Mr. Chairman, I think it would be a good idea to ask Councillor Jan Warwick, who's leading on this, to put a bit more detail on that point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Rob. Jan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I'm really pleased we're now able to share with Cabinet how much has already been achieved through the quiet, dedicated, hard work of our top officer team. This is a very thorough strategy document with an emerging action plan, but we are in no way complacent. This is just the start. So we know that significant action is required across our whole organisation, as well as with our partners, with residents, communities and businesses, to meet the challenging target of carbon neutrality by 2050 and to build resilience to a 2°C rise in temperature. There's been considerable activity over the last year to progress actions to meet our targets. In addition to our engagement with the Greening campaign to help tackle residential emissions at a household level, I'm delighted to announce a further 3 community projects, which from today will begin to support the Council's efforts in addressing residential emissions and reducing Hampshire-wide carbon emissions. These projects will help build capacity within our communities to tackle climate change, which will benefit both our residents and our local economy. These 3 projects are, firstly, our telephone and online advice for residents on climate change and sustainability. This will be based at our own Environment Centre and will provide independent advice and support for residents on how they can make sustainable decisions to help reduce energy use in their own homes. We will be establishing a community energy network across Hampshire. One of the major gaps in Hampshire is the limited amounts of renewable energy generated in the county, which is currently less than 3%. Just ignore my phone ringing. Sorry about that. Community Energy South will deliver a project to stimulate the growth of a community energy sector across Hampshire. The emphasis will be on enabling local communities to build their own self-sustainability capacity to achieve ongoing reductions in emissions. There will also be a targeted solar buying scheme for Hampshire. Solar Together is a group buying scheme which gives residents the opportunity to buy high-quality solar panels at a highly competitive price. So the County Council will help organise this innovative scheme for homeowners, as well as for small and medium-sized non-domestic enterprises, to help to deliver our vision of a zero carbon county. Now, we had some deputies earlier on, and Philippa Brearley spoke very well about the importance of wider community engagement. And this is also key to delivering the strategy and to ensure that our communities have the opportunity to input into the developing action plan that will accompany the strategy. And we are holding a community expert consultative forum on climate change next month. So this event will provide an opportunity for meaningful engagement to advise upon the development and the delivery of the action plan to accompany the strategy, and will be made up of relevant professionals, academics and community representatives from a range of organisations across Hampshire, and we want to include our youth representatives too. Finally, partnership working will be ever so critical with our public sector partners across Hampshire. That includes the district councils, the town, the parish councils, our neighbouring authorities, and a range of government agencies. We've also recently joined the UK 100 Countryside Climate Network. This joins other ambitious council leaders across the predominantly rural parts of the country. Collectively, we represent over 40% of England's land area to make a real action and change on climate change. So we must embed climate change thinking into everything we do. And so I'm therefore delighted that we can launch our strategy today and also demonstrate how much significant activity is already taking place across Hampshire. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jan. Now, if any of my Cabinet colleagues have anything to add to the discussion, Councillor Reid, Steve Reid.
Thank you, Leader. I think this is an excellent report. The challenge that I think we should put to everybody is actually to review not the report, but the appendices. Appendix 2 especially details the key risks that we think we face, the actions that could be taken, and the service areas which are responsible for implementing those actions. And there's a lot in there, and I mean, somebody's mentioned already rewilding of the highway verges, and that comes under highways. We took our dog out for a walk the other day, and somebody stopped us and said, when are these verges and fields going to be cut? I said, well, actually, these are being left so that it encourages wildflowers and pollinators and does good for the environment. And he said, harumph, so you don't care at all for people with hay fever, and walked off. And I thought sometimes, you know, there's no winning on these discussions, and that carbon neutrality is something for other people to achieve, not myself. And that seems to be a prevalent attitude. But we're at a cusp at the moment. We are on the cusp of stopping doing analysis and actually turning that analysis into an action plan. And what this report, especially in Appendix 2, has done is to lay out hundreds of actions. There's about 45 pages packed with areas where we've identified risks and actions to take. And I think the challenge we have to put to all the people who have made delegations today is, please review Appendix 2 and give us even more suggestions on what can be done. I think there's a good understanding of the problem. We don't need the problem restated, we need the solutions to implement. So to the people who came up, and lest I be unfair to the first speaker who came up with some specifics on Winchester, I think the general comment I would make is that we want our environmentalist lobby groups to come up with specifics that will help us to improve Appendix 2 and come up with even more things that we can do. And if we are going to refer this matter to the select committees, and I can see good things there, it's Appendix 2 that really matters. That's where the action plan is. And we need to encourage people to look at that and help us to improve it.
Thank you, Steve. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Yes, I'm absolutely in agreement with what Councillor Reid has said. The important thing here, of course, is that not only has there been a phenomenal amount of work done, and particular congratulations to Chitra Nadaraja, who's actually led on this from an officer point of view, but the speakers that we had to start with this morning, all of them brought out some valuable points. The key thing to remember, of course, is that this is just a starting point. We're in the starting blocks, and this is establishing that the point where we are on the track, if you like. It's a dynamic situation. Mr. Heath, Martin Heath, actually particularly raised an issue over focusing, for example, on emissions other than carbon emissions. Well, I think to the extent that we need to, we should emphasise, and I'm sure we will and do, that in actual fact we are looking way beyond just pure carbon. Nitrogen dioxide is an absolute classic because it's one of the other products of incineration as well. So I think that, you know, this is a really good starting point, and I pay tribute to the work that's been done so far. But we're on a journey. And could I also say a particular thank you to Councillor Jan Warwick, who I know has actively and very closely engaged with the local community. Philippa Brearley, who was our third speaker this morning, will know from personal experience of the extent to which she's engaged. And I think this is an indicator of the way we're going to take this forward. So I'm very grateful, but it's only a start.
Thank you. Judith.
Thank you. Yes, apologies if I repeat what other people have said, but I keep losing connection. But we heard from our deputies this morning a lot about reducing emissions. And of course, that is hugely important. And a lot of people want to know what they can do to do their bit. And when I came to the event for parish councils and listened to the people from the greening campaign, just getting people to stop running the water when they clean their teeth, you know, I'm finding an uphill struggle just with my family to get them to stop doing that. But these all make a difference. But I'm pleased to hear in the report and brought out by colleagues this morning that it's not just about reducing emissions, but it's also about building resilience. And for instance, we've just had, I think it closed last week, a consultation on Hampshire's plans to manage water resources, making the county more resilient to the impact of flooding. So, you know, it's a two-pronged approach, if you like, and I'm very pleased to that was brought out in the paper and in the strategy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Judith. Well, I don't think there are any other comments from my Cabinet colleagues. I've got one other person that's put their hand up, but I would ask Jonathan Glenn to send a quick email to me and to Jan, and we'll deal with that offline. So if there are no other comments from my Cabinet colleagues, could I get you to agree the recommendations at 5, little 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the normal way? And that is unanimous. Thank you for that. So we can now move on to the next item, which is transport for the South East. And I'm conscious, obviously, that we're running over time at the moment. So I hope we can dispatch these two last agenda items as quickly as possible without actually giving them due consideration if it's needed. Councillor, the Director of ETE, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I will be brief because I think this is a relatively straightforward report. The proposal today is to seek the County Council's endorsement for the emerging subnational transport body, Transport for the South East, which has been coming together over the last few years. The County Council's been central to its development. And it becomes, I think, particularly important at a time when central governments are looking at significantly increasing investment in infrastructure to try and help kickstart the economic recovery. But central governments are also very clear about the need to address regional imbalance and looking at favouring investment and development in the Midlands and the North. And at that time, I think it's particularly important that the South East has a strong voice and a consistent voice on its transport investment priorities. The proposal is to establish a formal statutory subnational transport body by making a submission to the Secretary of State to invite him to confirm its status. But alongside the governance and the proposal to establish the body is a transport strategy for the South East. And again, Councillor Humby has been instrumental to the development of the transport strategy as well as the governance arrangements. And I think, as was mentioned in the previous item, the strategy for transport for the South East has very much placed climate change considerations at its heart, and it's a very ambitious strategy to try to change the transport system regionally, and very much along the lines of our own local emerging work on the local transport plan in Hampshire. The transport strategy has been subject to extensive consultation, Leader, and a large number of responses were made, and they were acted on and taken into account by Transport for the South East, which has now finalised that report, and Cabinet basically being asked to endorse the proposal and the strategy, and for those or to approve those, and for those decisions to also be taken to full council for endorsement later in the week. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Stuart. Not before time. We need a transport board for the South East so that we're not falling behind the rest of the country, and the sooner the better as far as I'm concerned. Rob, Councillor Humby.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we're short on time now, so I'll be very brief. This is about partnership working and about lobbying in partnership as well. This is a group of 16 upper tier authorities working with lots of other partners as well. So very pleased that we've been able to do that and achieve that. I mentioned it in the previous paper on climate change, and I would just mention the strategies through the Transport for South East. It is underpinned on the following principles, and that's why I wanted to mention it. Supporting economic growth, but not at any cost. Achieving environmental sustainability. Planning for successful places, and putting the user at the heart of the transport system. And I think that's very important to mention that. There has been sort of a key shift, if you like, in the thinking. It started before COVID-19, but this is, I think, just sort of accelerated that and how we're going to proceed. And all the authorities right across the board have agreed and accepted that. So I hope the Cabinet will support the paper, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Any other comments? Can we go straight to the vote then? Recommendations. That para 5, 6, 7 and 8. Are you all in agreement? You appear to be. You are. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the final item on the agenda, which is the Serving Hampshire report. And I think I'm right in saying that Deborah Harkin is presenting that report, I believe.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. The report provides an overview of the County Council's performance during 1920 against the Serving Hampshire strategic plan, and it also provides updates against delivery of the authority's equality objectives and the findings from the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman report. Section 3 sets out the process for reporting on the County Council's performance, which includes receiving data, including a risk rating from departments against a core set of performance metrics. Paragraph 3.7 highlights that the work is being undertaken to refresh the current strategic plan, which runs until 2021, and to revise the performance management framework as part of that process. And the final draft documentation will be provided to Cabinet for approval in the late autumn, alongside the 2021 half-year performance report. Section 4 sets out the overall performance outcomes for the 2019-20 year, reporting that performance remained good, with no areas of high risk, a significant achievement given the backdrop of increasing demand and cost pressures, as well as sustained significant savings. Paragraph 4.7 provides a summary of performance highlights, including how the County Council successfully implemented its response to COVID-19 outbreak during the month of the performance year, during the final month of the performance year, and more detailed information is provided at appendices 2 and 3. Section 5 provides an update on progress against the County Council's equality objectives, and in particular work undertaken to advance the organisation's position as an inclusive employer. The Corporate Inclusion, Diversity and Wellbeing Strategic Work Programme will continue to be developed to support key equality objectives and shaped in response to recent events following the tragic death of George Floyd, as well as growing evidence of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on people from BME backgrounds. And as the report states, the County Council will continue to do all it can to protect the vibrancy and diversity of Hampshire communities, reducing inequality and advancing cohesion, and takes this agenda very seriously. And then finally, paragraph 5.3 onwards details work undertaken to develop a modern slavery statement, setting out how the County Council is taking action to prevent modern slavery, including human trafficking, in its business activities and throughout its supply chains. The County Council is not required by law to publish such a statement, but is doing so as a matter of good practice, and Cabinet are asked to consider and approve that statement. The final section of the report sets out the findings of the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman report, and at which point I will hand over to the Head of Law and Governance. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And Barbara, are you commenting now on this report?
Yes, Chairman. It just ever so briefly, in mindfulness of the time, in effect, the performance report contains two sets of data. Paragraph 6.3, which I think is page 623 of your report, is information on the actual determinations received for the year ending March this year from the Ombudsman. You'll note that we received 33 determinations, out of which in 21 cases the Ombudsman found there been a fault. And Appendix 5 at page 649 of the report contains more detail of the individual decisions. Paragraph 6.4 of the report is information on overall references to the Ombudsman for the year 2018 to 19. There's a slightly different timing in the report, in two reporting years it would appear to be. The reason for the slightly different timing is that details regarding references to the Ombudsman, which includes actually the overwhelming majority of complaints which the Ombudsman, for reasons set out in the report, determines not to investigate. We don't receive information on those until July, hence the 2 reporting years in the report. In 2018-19, being the latest year's figures, there were 122 references to the Ombudsman, of which about 1/5 were investigated. Paragraph 6.5 of the report provides some benchmarking information with comparator county councils. As in previous years, it can be noted consistently that the Ombudsman receives fewer complaints about the county council, and of those complaints which the Ombudsman determines he will investigate, around 1/5, that is, fewer are upheld than other comparator county councils. Chairman, unless you'd like any further information, I'll stop there.
Are there any comments at all, bearing in mind the time? Councillor Reid.
Just to say, Leader, this is a very objective report. You'll recall me saying in past Cabinet meetings that we have been moving away from a self-analysis to using as many outside measures as we can to get an objective measure of Hampshire's performance. It's a very difficult one for the officers to write because they want to be totally objective. If the news is good, and it is good, they don't want the report to be self-congratulatory. I think they have struck a very good balance here, and this report is one that should be commended to the Council, and in particular the statement about modern-day slavery, particularly apposite given the discovery in some areas well outside Hampshire of what can only be called sweatshops. I think it's absolutely right that we should take a stance on this and recommend it to full Council.
Thank you, Steve. Andrew?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Councillor Reid actually sort of overlapped rather with what I was going to say. I certainly am full of appreciation for the active work which has been going on in terms of equality and diversity and so on. I know this is something which Mrs. Harkin has actually led on and is following up rigorously. And it's something which obviously I think consumes all of us, certainly in the current climate. It's certainly focused attention. But there's been a huge amount of work which has gone on over the question of modern slavery. I think that's a very, very thorough report, particularly bearing in mind that this isn't something which is actually required of the county, but I think it is an excellent thing to do. It's setting a standard, and like Councillor Reid, I certainly commend this for approval.
Thank you, Andrew. Anyone else? Can we then agree the recommendations at 1.1, A, B, C and D? Just check you all. And we have a majority and we have everyone. That's unanimous. Thank you all very much. That ends the Cabinet meeting. For those of you who are staying on for an encore at the Outbreak committee, I suggest we go back online in 5 minutes' time. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry it's gone on so long, but we've covered a lot of important ground, bearing in mind the pandemic. And I will see you all no doubt later in the week.